Welcome, friends, and get ready to listen as Rupert reads The Adventures of Grandfather Frogs, Chapter 16 through 18. Chapter 16. The Merry Little Breezes Work Hard. The Merry Little Breezes almost shouted with delight when they saw Farmer Brown's boy drop Grandfather Frog to feel for his handkerchief and wipe out the dust which they had thrown in his eyes. Then he had to climb the fence and chase his hat through the garden. They would let him almost get his hands on it, and then, just as though he had surely had it, they would snatch it away. It was great fun for the Merry Little Breezes, but they were not going to do it for fun. No, indeed, they were not doing it for fun. They were doing it to lead Farmer Brown's boy away from Grandfather Frog. Just as soon as they dared, they dropped the hat and then separated and rushed away in all different directions across the Green Meadows, over to the Green Forest, and down the Smiling Pool. What were they going for? Why, to hunt for some of Grandfather Frog's friends and their help. You see, the Merry Little Breezes could make Farmer Brown's boy drop Grandfather Frog, but they couldn't untie a knot or cut a string, and this is just what had got to be done to set Grandfather Frog free, for his hind legs were tied together. Now, they were looking for someone with sharp teeth who thought enough of Grandfather Frog to come and help him. One thought of Striped Chipmunk and started for the old stone wall to look for him. Another wanted to search for Danny Meadow Mouse. A third headed for the dear old briar patch after Peter Rabbit. A fourth remembered Jimmy Skunk and how you had once set Blacky the Crow free from a snare. The fifth remembered what sharp teeth Happy Jack Squirrel had and hurried over the Green Forest to look for him. A sixth started straight away for the Smiling Pool to tell Jerry Muskrat, and every one of them raced as fast as they could. All this time, Grandfather Frog was without hope. Yes, sir, poor old Grandfather Frog was wholly in despair. You see, he didn't know what the Merry Little Breezes were trying to do, and he was so frightened and confused that he couldn't think. When Farmer Brown's boy dropped him, he lay right where he was for a few minutes. Then, right close at hand, he saw an old board. Without really thinking, he tried to get to it, for it looked as if there might be room for him to hide under it. It was hard work, for his long hind legs, which he uses for jumping, were tied together. The best he could do was to crawl and wiggle and pull himself along. Just as Farmer Brown's boy started to climb the fence back into the long lane, his hat in his hand, Grandfather Frog reached the old board and crawled under it. Now, when the Merry Little Breezes had thrown the dust in Farmer Brown's boy's face and snatched his hat, he had dropped Grandfather Frog in such a hurry that he didn't notice just where he had dropped him. So now he didn't know the exact place to look for him. But he knew pretty near, and he hadn't the least doubt but what he would find him. He had just started to look when the dinner horn sounded. Farmer Brown's boy hesitated. He was hungry. If he was late, he might lose his dinner. He could come back later to look for Grandfather Frog, for with his legs tied, Grandfather Frog couldn't get far. So, with a last look, to make sure of the place Farmer Brown's boy started for the house. If the Merry Little Breezes had known this, they would have felt ever so much better. But they didn't, so they hurried as fast as ever they could find Grandfather Frog's friends and worked until they were almost too tired to move. For it seemed as if every single one of Grandfather Frog's friends had taken that particular day to go away from home. So while Farmer Brown's boy ate his dinner, and Grandfather Frog lay hiding under the old board in the long lane, the Merry Little Breezes did their best to find help for him. Chapter 17. Striped Chipmunk Cuts the String. Hippity-hop, flippity-flop, all the summer day my mother turned me from the house and sent me out to play. Striped Chipmunk knew perfectly well that this was just nonsense, but Striped Chipmunk learned a long time ago that when you are just bubbling right over with good feeling, there's fun in saying and doing foolish things, and that is just how he was feeling. So he ran along the old fence on one side of the long lane, saying foolish things and cutting up foolish capers just because he felt so good, and all the time seeing all that those bright little eyes of his could take in. Now Striped Chipmunk and the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind are great friends, very great friends indeed. Almost every morning they have a grand frolic together. But this morning, the Merry Little Breezes hadn't come over to the old stone wall where Striped Chipmunk makes his home. Anyway, they hadn't come at the usual time. Striped Chipmunk had waited a little while, and then, because he was feeling so good, he had decided to take a run down the long lane to see if anything new had happened there. This is how it happened that when one of the Merry Little Breezes did go to look for him, and was terribly anxious to ask him to come and help for Grandfather Frog, he was nowhere to be found. But Striped Chipmunk didn't know anything about that. He scampered along the top rails of the old fence, jumping on top of a post, and sat to wash his face and hands. For Striped Chipmunk is very neat, and cannot bear to be in the least bit dirty. He looked up and winked at old Mr. Buzzard, sailing around and around way up in the blue sky. He chased his own tail around and round until he nearly fell off the post. He made a wry face in the direction of Redtail the Hawk, whom he could see sitting on top of the tall tree way over in the Green Meadows. He scolded Bowser the Hound, who happened to be trotting along the long lane, and didn't stop scolding until Bowser was out of sight. Then he kicked up his heels and whisked along the old fence again. Halfway across a shaky old rail, he suddenly stopped. His bright eyes had seen something that filled him with curiosity. Quite as much curiosity as Peter Rabbit would have had. It was a piece of string. Yes, sir, it was a piece of string. Now, Striped Chipmunk often had found pieces of string, so there was nothing particularly interesting in the string itself. What did interest him and make him very curious was the fact that the piece of string kept moving. Every few seconds it gave a little jerk. Who ever heard of a piece of string moving all by itself? Certainly Striped Chipmunk never had. He couldn't understand it. For a few minutes he watched it from the top rail of the old fence. Then he scurried down to the ground and, a few steps at a time, stopping to watch sharply between each little run, he drew nearer and nearer to that queer acting string. It gave him a funny feeling inside to see a string acting like that, so he was very careful not to get too near. He looked at it from one side, then ran around and looked at it from the other side. At last he got where he could see that one end of the string was under an old board, and then he began to understand. Of course there was somebody hiding under that old board and jerking the string. Striped Chipmunk sat down and scratched his head thoughtfully. Whoever was pulling that string couldn't be very big, or he would have been able to crawl under the old board. Therefore he didn't need be afraid. A gleam of mischief twinkled in Striped Chipmunk's eyes. He seized the other end of the string and began to pull. Such a jerking and yanking as began right away. But he held on and pulled harder. Then out from under the old board appeared the queer, webbed feet of Grandfather Frog tied together. Striped Chipmunk was so surprised that he let go of the string and nearly fell over backwards. "Why, Grandfather Frog, under the sun, what are you doing here?" he shouted. When Striped Chipmunk let go of the string, Grandfather Frog promptly drew his feet back under the old board. But when he heard Striped Chipmunk's voice, he slowly and painfully crawled out. He told how he had been caught and tied by Farmer Brown's boy, and finally dropped near the old board. He told how terribly frightened he was and how sore his legs were. Striped Chipmunk didn't wait for him to finish. In a flash he was at work with his sharp teeth and had cut the cruel string before Grandfather Frog had finished his story. Chapter 18. Grandfather Frog Hurries Away. When Striped Chipmunk cut the string that bound the long legs of Grandfather Frog together, Grandfather Frog was so relieved that he hardly knew what to do. Of course, he thanked Striped Chipmunk over and over again. Striped Chipmunk said that was nothing, just nothing at all, and that he was very glad indeed to help Grandfather Frog. "We folks who live in the Great World have to help one another," said Striped Chipmunk, "because we never know when we need help ourselves. Now, you take my advice, Grandfather Frog, and go back to the Smiling Pool as fast as you can. The Great World is no place for an old fellow like you, because you don't know how to take care of yourself." Now, when he said that, Striped Chipmunk made a great mistake. Old people never like to be told that they are old, or that they do not know all that there is to know. Grandfather Frog straightened up and tried to look very dignified. "Ja rum," he said. I'll have you know, Striped Chipmunk, that people were coming to me for advice before you were born. It was just an accident that Farmer Brown's boy caught me, and I'd like to see him do it again. Yes, sir, I'd like to see him do it again." Dear me, Grandfather Frog was boasting. If he had been safe at home in the Smiling Pool, there might have been some excuse for boasting, but way over here in the long lane, not even knowing the way back to the Smiling Pool, it was foolish, very foolish indeed. No one knew that better than Striped Chipmunk. But he has a great deal of respect for Grandfather Frog, and he knew, too, that Grandfather Frog was feeling very much out of sorts, and very much mortified to think that he had been caught in such a scrape. So he put a hand over his mouth to hide a smile as he said, "Of course, he isn't going to catch you. I know how wise and smart you are, but you look to be very tired, and there are so many dangers out here in the great world that it seems to me that the very best thing you can do is to go back to the Smiling Pool." But Grandfather Frog is stubborn, you know. He had started out to see the great world, and didn't want the little people of the Green Meadows and the Green Forest to think that he was afraid. The truth is, Grandfather Frog was more afraid of being laughed at than he was of the dangers around him, which shows just how foolish wise people can be sometimes. So he shook his head. "Chug-rum," said he. "I am going to see the great world first, and then I am going back to the Smiling Pool. Do you happen to know where there is any water? I am very thirsty." Now, over on the other side of the long lane was a spring where Farmer Brown's boy filled his jug with clear, cold water to take with him to the cornfield when he had to work there. Striped Chipmunk knew all about that spring, for he had been there for a drink many times. So he told Grandfather Frog just where the spring was and how to get to it. He had even offered to show the way, but Grandfather Frog said that he would rather go alone. "Watch out, Grandfather Frog, and don't fall in, because you might not be able to get out again," warned Striped Chipmunk. Grandfather Frog looked up sharply to see if Striped Chipmunk was making fun of him. The very idea of anyone thinking that he, who lived in water all his life, couldn't get out when he pleased. But Striped Chipmunk looked really in earnest, so Grandfather Frog swallowed the quick retort on the tip of his tongue, thanked Striped Chipmunk, and hurried away to look for the spring, for he was very, very thirsty. Besides, he was very, very hot, and he hurried still faster as he thought of the cool bath he would have when he found the spring. And that's the end of today's read, and if you liked what you heard, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Thank you.